I'm David Noble. This is the 9 o'clock meeting. Now, different people like different drivers, they like different teams. Quite a few people with Ferrari and McLaren seem to have be more team than driver, perhaps, but that's changing a little bit now. But I know too many people who speak about McLaren, so I'm going to speak to someone who supports another team. So, please welcome to the channel, Denzel Clarkson, AMG Dens. Good to meet you again.
Oh, thank you so much, David. Yeah, I mean, first time meeting, but it feels like I've known you
Yeah,
for a long time.
yeah. We chat on sort of comments and videos and on Twitter and stuff. So, but yeah, this is the first time I actually spoke to you and seen you properly.
Exactly, and it's just amazing, just like this F1 Twitter space, and just generally how easy it is to connect with people, even from just different fan bases. And yeah, for the most part, when people aren't being toxic, it's actually a nice place to be. So I absolutely agree with you on things you said there.
Yeah, no. Um, so before I veer off madly in a tangent on loads of other stuff, because that tends to be the way these videos go, trying to stick to topic for a little while. What got you into Mercedes? I mean, it says on your Twitter profile, Mercedes connoisseur. So, what caused that?
Yeah, well, David, it's just been quite an interesting journey for me being like a Mercedes fan and follower of the brand because it all for me kind of kicked off when I was at university. I was in the second year of my law degree and I was writing in like applications to different law firms to see if I can get some work experience from them, etc., etc. And a lot of them were just giving you that generic response of, oh, yeah, whilst we're so fascinated to hear from you, Denzel, we would kind of require some people with some more experience. And I was like, how does that make any sense? Like, how could you want somebody to have more experience in a role or like a training kind of vacation scheme where you're offering like young people an opportunity to gain experience? So I just sat down there and I took a long, hard look at myself. And I sat down with my mom, and she was like, you have other interests. It's not just law that you do. Why do you not try and like find like a part-time job, maybe in a dealership? Try and find something where you can develop your people skills, and you never know what might happen. So I was like, oh, okay. Moms always know best. So I was like, let me see what I can do. So I wrote like an email to the dealer principal of the local dealership in Nottingham because that's where I was studying at the time. I showed my interest. I mentioned how much I followed the motorsport aspect of it. And for a while, he kind of pushed me off and said, maybe next week, give me a call when I'm like less free. Or it's the end of the month, we have like 30 C63s outside waiting to be sold. And I was like, come on, man, you have to kind of give me a break. So eventually I did get that opportunity. I went in, and again, I just think that initial experience of just being face to face, having that interaction, him kind of seeing where I was at, what I wanted to do, what I could bring to the dealership, made him change his mind. I was like, okay, I'll give you a run at it. So I worked the entire summer just for free, just doing some work experience from them. This was just for the passenger side of the company. So it was the service department, the sales department. They even had like a VIP department, which, was quite interesting because we saw Wild Ed Sheeran appear. So it's cool kind of selling him a G-Wagon. But through all of that, they were like, we really like your energy and just how positive you are about the brand. We'd love you to be an ambassador here. And although there's probably not a full-time role for you, because at the time I didn't have a driving license, they said we would still love to have you in on a part-time basis. So I continued to work there part-time whilst getting my law degree. And I remember one summer, I think it was in Wellington, there was like an annual car show kind of thing where loads of people with different cars, different like dealerships would come together. Classic car owners as well would come there with their classic Ferraris. I know David was probably there too with his F40, so
yeah, highway. I'll show you my F40. That's my
ooh,
F40.
Lego F40. Love it, man. That's awesome. So yeah, just through experiences like that, just it was just amazing to just go there and to be like a brand ambassador in that sense, and just talk to people about cars and just the motorsport aspect of it, and even get these little kids just like, oh, can I rev that AMG GT? And I'd be like, yeah, go ahead, that would have been one of my dreams too. So yeah, in terms of the Mercedes aspect, that's where it all began, and then ironically, kind of the circle goes full story. There was this one day where like a guy came in by the name of Andrew Nashid. I'm sure you wouldn't mind me mentioning him. And most of the salespeople there, they were just like, he looks like a bit of a tire kicker, which for most people who don't really get the whole car sales thing, like a tire kicker is like a euphemism people use for like a customer that's not serious. So they thought he was going to come in and like waste time essentially. But my whole thing was you can't judge a book by its cover. So we just got talking and he was like, "You're quite young. What do you do?" I was like, "Well, I work here part-time, but I'm studying for my law degree at the moment." And he's like, I work in the law firm as the partner just across the road. So I was like, okay. What were the chances? So again, just through working at Mercedes-Benz, it gave me an opportunity to then meet a solicitor, and this whole void which had been missing from my life of getting an opportunity to work in a law firm then came to me in the most kind of indirect way of me working in the dealership and then, meeting the solicitor. So yeah, from that day onwards, I was really sad when I had to leave the dealership, but then I knew what I wanted to pursue career-wise, and yeah, just I've always had that affinity to the brand ever since. So, there's that. But then in terms of the F1 side of it too, I've got the great man in the background too, Mr. Michael Schumacher. And again, just I remember being like 3 or 4 years old and just like I think Sundays was just a sacred time where you would sit in front of the TV. I'm not quite sure if it was the ITV coverage with Jim Rossentile or the BBC coverage, but you just hear like The Chain by Fleetwood Mac. And I just remember my dad just being in his element. You couldn't ask him for anything. You couldn't say anything to him. You just sat in front of the TV. You watched the Grand Prix, and it was just amazing, just even in the late 90s with, Mika Hakkinen, Michael Schumacher, Juan Pablo Montoya, and just that generation of Formula One as well was really cool with the V10. So yeah, just so many memories when I think about Mercedes, but also just Formula One and Ferrari too.
I mean, you said about Michael Schumacher in the background. Of course, a lot of people actually don't realise that he was a source Mercedes junior back in the day. He was one of their boys a long time before he joined up Micro.
Exactly, yeah, because he was part of I think it was the Sauber Mercedes program back then, the young driver program,
Yeah.
which is crazy because then you see these pictures of a young Michael Schumacher, and even then he didn't really age or change much in his demeanor or his looks and stuff like that. But of course, just he was like a Mercedes driver, but then he had the issue I think with I forget the name of the driver, but there was the Eddie Jordan thing that happened as well, where I think one of the drivers got arrested for having a taxi.
Bertrand Gachot, I think it was. Yeah, that
was it.
Assault a taxi cab with driver with
Pepper
was it
spray?
CS spray or something?
Yeah.
Apparently it's legal in France, but of course because he came over here, he wasn't aware of like differences in laws and stuff. And they figured that okay, he'll probably get off with just a warning or whatever because cultural differences, whatever. And the guy wasn't like massively injured or whatever. But basically, the judge decided he was going to make a big show out of it and then sentenced him to something like 18 months in jail.
Yeah,
So
which again,
that's going to change your day.
of course, and I think in a way that funny story kind of changed the outlook of Formula One for the next decade in terms of what Michael then went on to do, as you know.
Yeah. So it's fun that we've been doing this video for about 5 minutes and we're completely off the original topic already.
We love to see it. This is what it's all about, David, and that's the thing
Absolutely.
I love about these conversations.
Well, that's the thing with conversation is it sort of spirals everywhere, but I don't know. So affinity with the brand through working in the dealership and whatever else, how would that lead on to the motorsport stuff? I mean, I know you've said previously that you got into it through watching it with your dad and stuff, but how did like the dealership lead to the brand affinity leading to the watching the stuff on the track and cheering for Raffaele Marciello?
Oh yeah, well there's that too, and yeah, there's so many different facets to it, like I mentioned, Dave. Because of course there was working in a dealership, which again kind of it made me just grow that affinity, and maybe where the law firms weren't giving me the time of day a Mercedes dealership did. So there was that, but then also, like I said, like a huge fan of Michael. So watching him like throughout my childhood when he was at Ferrari and just seeing the dominance, throughout that early 2000 period was great. Then obviously he retired, so I kind of followed Lewis, but then I didn't really love McLaren because it was like Mika Hakkinen versus like Schumi, so I was like a Ferrari fan, and I was like, I like Lewis, but I don't like McLaren. And then obviously you had that kind of odd kind of year in 2009 where obviously Honda at the 2008, 2007 recession, they said they were going to pull out of Formula One. Then you had Braun say, well, you know, I want to take a crack at the whip. I'll have my own team. I'll try and get Mercedes on board as like, you know, the main engine like manufacturer and supplier, which I think to McLaren's undoing was kind of a big thing. And Ron Dennis
Oh
didn't.
yeah, Martin Whitmarsh could have changed history so much if he had said, "No, we're the works outfit. We don't want you to have it."
There you
But
go.
he armed the opposition, and the rest is history.
Exactly. So there was that weird, or not weird, but I should say very quirky 2009 year. And then, of course, Braun said, okay, I would sell it to Mercedes. And then you had that program, obviously, with Nico Rosberg and Michael Schumacher. And I think we even actually got the first and the last Mercedes replicas too. So this is Michael with the, I think it's the W01. So that's like the 2010 car. And then sadly, I get sad when I see this one. I then also have the W03, which is the one from Brazil. So
Mm.
yeah, just amazing cars. But like you mentioned as well, I think through working with Mercedes-Benz at the time, it opened my eyes not only just to Formula One, of course, but also the other disciplines of motorsport they have, because Mercedes have such a history, David, and I don't know, I could probably go on for years, but you know, you've got the
That's
DTM,
fine.
you know, which again was cool as well because at the dealership we obviously had the C63, which was like the flagship model, but then in DTM you actually had like the full wide arch C63 DTM car, which was
Oh,
just
that
nuts.
yeah, DTM cars were crazy. I always sort of had a theory that you don't need more than a GT3 because above that it gets a bit cartoonish.
Yeah,
But you see, I mean, I saw DTM at Brands Hatch a couple of times, and just seeing them there, when they get described as basically being like an LMP2 car with a body vaguely similar
like a
to a
shame.
production car on top. But they do look really. I mean, it's the fact of the matter is that Aston Martin went there to go do DTM, and against cars that were supposedly saloon cars, and that was the fastest track Aston Martin ever, and it was getting massacred by like BMWs and Audis and Mercedes and stuff. It's just really didn't. It was weird, you know.
This is exactly it. It's so
It's
true,
like
you know.
how can you get these supposed touring cars which can absolutely massacre supercars?
And this is the thing as well. It's with DTM, it's sad, and I actually wanted to have this conversation with you, maybe a bit later on. But just the state of DTM as to what it is now compared to what it was even before. Because I guess when I was just growing up, even when I was younger, you obviously had BMW with the M3, you had Mercedes with the 190e, you had Audi, of course, as well with their kind of saloon car as well, and even just other like Opel, I think had like a DTM team, which Keke Rosberg was like the head of at that time too, and so many different cool drivers like Bernd Snyder. Who's the guy that drives the safety car now in F1? That's
Yeah,
bad.
it's
Martin Brundle
always the
always
brain
talks about
goes.
him. Kind of blank.
Yeah.
But just I can't believe I forgot his name. Poor guy. But again, there's just so many legendary DTM drivers. So you had that going on at the time as well, and then even just Mercedes in the FIA kind of GT programs they're in, because there was the CLK GT in that kind of like halo era of like the McLaren F1 GTR, the Porsche 911 GT1, whatever. I just know them as 911s. They all look the same to me. I know Porsche fans are gonna probably come for me now, but yeah, so there's that. And then yeah, you just had like Mercedes with their radical project too. And
Oh,
even before that, when you look at the
there's
history of it,
the period in like, well, not World Endurance Championship, but the World Sports Car Championship or
there we
whatever,
go.
where Mercedes basically had a repitation for taking off.
Yeah, with Mark Webber at like on Le Mans with the
It was something like twice in the same weekend, wasn't it? It's
exactly.
just
Like I'm sure the
crazy.
W13 is probably taking cues from that COK. It's like, yeah, I know how to be like a very unstable, like downforce generated car. So, yeah, there's just so many stories. And even if you go back earlier as well, David, when you look at like just what Mercedes is essentially, with Carl Benz being the innovator of the first gasoline-powered vehicle, and then obviously as well the merger with Daimler when it became like Daimler Mercedes or Mercedes Daimler, and then even just the AMG partnership as well. You know, with Alfred and I think Melcher as well, two German engineers that then came close with the Daimler group, and I think developed one of the early, I think it was like the Red Pig, that basically debuted at like the Spa 24 Hours, which was crazy as well to see just a normal saloon car with such a heavy engine. I think it was a 6-liter displacement engine as well. So you can imagine how unruly that car would have been. But just the innovation of the brand, and even just them being the first to innovate the I think it was the airbag in 1980 as well. I know that it was Saab that did the seatbelt. Was it Saab? I think it's Saab or Volvo. Volvo did the seatbelt, and then Mercedes did the airbag. But there's so many cool innovations that they've made, and just even what they innovate today and try and bring to road cars. I think this makes them so much like relevant with just today's society in car development and manufacturing as well. And yeah, just like you have Ferrari, which I think is on the top of the pedestal, and then you just have like Mercedes, which is just like, you can get a Mercedes truck, you can get like a Mercedes AMG, you can get like a Mercedes A-Class, just they're just all encompassing, which I think is cool for a brand which
Speaking
arguably
of
started
getting a
first.
Mercedes, haven't you recently got a Mercedes?
Yeah, so I've had them before, David, but this is like my first AMG, so now I can
AMG,
officially live to the name of being AMG Dens. But yeah, she's a beauty. C43 AMG 4MATIC, V6 twin turbo engine, 400 horsepower, and that thing just goes like the stick. Honestly, it's so unruly. I know there's lots of people out there that will say, "Oh, it's not a real AMG." Real AMGs have the one man, one engine principle from our father back in Germany, and I hear that, but it's still a car with, AMG developed suspension, AMG developed a V6 engine, gearbox as well is fully developed by AMG. So it's amazing, even for like a 26-year-old like me, that they've worked out their market and they've tried to find little segments where people could fit in. Because you know how it is as well, David, with just gas prices in the UK going up as well, and push just for like electric and hybrid. So I think that is like a bygone era almost of like big displacement V8 engines and just how the motor industry is going to move forward.
I mean, there's that thing is, I went to this American Speed Fest thing at Brands Hatch recently, and you see all the Mustangs and all the this and all that and the other. And it's great to see them, but it already sort of almost feels like kind of history. Like it is something you see at a show or something, So, but I mean, it's the same when you go to like a Ferrari event or a whatever event or a Porsche one, I suppose. You see all these millions of pounds. Went to a Ferrari one last year, and my son sort of looking over the thing at the racetrack at Silverstone, and you've got SF90s going past, and you've got like Ferrari F40s going past, and you 288 GTOs going past, all these cars going past, all of which worth many times more than my house. And he's standing there going, are they just normal road cars?
Son, you might want to reconsider that one. Yeah, just they are just literally one of a kind.
We always joked about my son because his name is Ayrton.
Should be more of a McLaren guy.
Well, his mum's a McLaren fan. But the joke always was going to be, we'll give him a name like that, Ayrton James, so Ayrton Senna, James Hunt, and he'll probably turn out to be an accountant with a bicycle.
It's always the case, though, isn't it, David?
And he is very good with numbers.
That's good. You'll have that F40 sooner than you know it, David.
Well, I'm relying on my son to buy me the
F40. I do exactly the same, to be honest.
So, we've got a shared thing with going with to the Raffaele Marcello thing. I mean, you had him on your channel recently. Obviously, I'm aware. I sort of followed him over to GTs and stuff because I'm only sort of been watching GT racing probably since about 2015. Before that, was a little bit of touring car, a little whatever else, Formula One, obviously. But because we didn't get Sky till about 2012, it's like suddenly your access to like the wider world of racing suddenly goes up because just you trying to watch it previously prior to that. This is, where did you find it? So it's only been in the last few years, I think, with between YouTube and more channels on Sky showing racing and Sky F1 itself showing more other things, because they had British GT on there, the Silverstone round a few weeks ago. That the access to it has grown, so more people are getting to see more things. But I sort of followed Raffaele Marcello over to that sort of thing because I remember him being in GP2 when he was still backed by Ferrari. So there's like him, Antonio Fuoco, who was also a Ferrari junior, and he's now in GTs, of course,
G3
with
as well.
Ferrari. So it's sort of coming full circle to a certain extent from them. But no, one of the questions I was going to ask you was about sort of like Mercedes and stuff. So how much is it like the history and stuff that you're into, of course, because there's a lot of people who perhaps don't know so much, who are sort of like, they're new to Formula One or whatever else. They don't have the history of some of the other teams and things. And it's like, they were racing in like 1902 or something stupid.
Exactly.
That Mercedes have history. It's, I mean, I'm a Ferrari fan, and I'm sort of turn around and go, yeah, Enzo was in racing cars back in like 1919, So, but Mercedes are one of the few companies on earth that can trace a lineage of racing back even before then. So,
Yeah,
but
I agree, and sorry to cut you there as well, David. It's
yeah,
amazing the things that Mercedes have just achieved as a brand. Because, like you mentioned as well, it all literally starts off with just one man just pioneering and just trying to do something practical, and then just to see the journey take off. And then obviously you had the Mercedes program in the 50s as well. So you had the likes of the
yeah,
great one Manuel Fangio, and then also Sterling Moss, to the great Sir Sterling Moss in the Silver Arrows. And even then, back then, the cars are actually like white. But then it's amazing how even like 50 years later or 70 years later, these things are still prevalent. Because even back then, they were trying to save weight. And it was a case of, well, the white paint was a bit too much. So then what they decided to do was strip it back. And then that's when it got its name, the Silver Arrows, because of the silver chassis tub that they had before, And then watching just how it picked off from there. And then I guess with all kind of brands, there's always like a dark history, a dark nature, and I guess you're aware
yeah,
also of like the 1955 Le Mans incident too,
yeah.
where unfortunately like lots of Le Mans spectators were killed when that one Mercedes car lost control and killed how many spectators as well, and it put a very dark cloud over Mercedes, I think. And I think even after just the F1 season, they just pulled out of all racing, and they
Well, yeah, it'd
weren't
be
seeing.
another 30 years before they went racing again properly. By the time they sort of got together with Sauber and World Sports Cars and went to DTM and stuff. That was like about 1985 they first did that, something like that. So,
Exactly.
that was part of my theory about where AMG possibly came from. It's just like almost filling in the racing gap for Mercedes in between time, because Mercedes themselves weren't doing it. So, an engineering tuning company sort of doing it on their behalf sort of made a certain amount of sense. But
Exactly. And whilst I guess they had the bad press, so those images would have been terrible. And I imagine if something like that were to happen today, football, racing in general would be questioned. And you'd have lots of different parties and governments coming together to see whether or not it's really even feasible. But even back then, yeah, it wouldn't have been a great publicity thing for them. They would have wanted to probably like take themselves out of the spotlight. And
yeah,
like you mentioned, it's actually a good theory because with AMG, it's almost like a second cloak or almost like a second division where you can try some of these experiments, and some of the stuff they've done is just wild. Like even when you have like the Mercedes Hammer, which is just literally a 190E, or like I think the car before then, and it's just like a stock looking AMG with wide arches and a huge engine developing so much power. It's funny just how the Germans go about it, and just the comparison between the Italians and Enzo Ferrari, which I want to discuss with you as well, and just hear your kind of take on just him as like an owner, a developer, like a pioneer in that sense, and just the Italian way of going things versus like the very German, mechanical, precise kind of way that, the reputation Mercedes, Audi, and Porsche have got, and BMW, of course, too.
yeah, it does seem to be. People do sort of say about it almost being a cultural thing in terms of like the way different manufacturers and stuff go about it. Because we always sort of think about the Germans sort of being very sort of cold, clinical, and everything sort of engineered to the nth degree. And the problem, to a certain extent, is that British people don't have that reputation. Or with the Italians, for example, very stylish, very flamboyant, and even if you look at the Ferrari racing team, for example, that's what we talk about when we see them. It's stylish and vibrant and alive, and the passion and whatever else it's always that.
Exactly.
So whether it's the people, the product, or whatever else, it is funny how stereotypes still seem to sort of reflect.
It's really interesting you mention that, because like you mentioned Raffaello Marcello, and I'll spill the beans on that one too. Like, interesting individual, because again, like, he's Swiss born but has his Italian roots, and he speaks Italian fluently, whatnot as well. And like you mentioned, was part of the Ferrari Academy and was there with the likes, like racing against Carlos Sainz, Daniel Kvyat as well, and many drivers we know in F1 today. But just to see how even for him, you got that flamboyant kind of Italian style when it comes to like the dyed hair, or wearing the pink boots for BWT, which is his sponsor. But then, like you mentioned too, like he's quite Swiss as well in the way that he answers questions, very kind of to the point, very focused, and actually very outspoken too. Because I guess another thing we could discuss was and like it was one of those ones where I knew he was going to be on the podcast, but I didn't want to push him too hard because I wanted to see if we can get him back in the future. But like leading up to it and just doing some due diligence, I could see that there was a bit of a kind of like a storm brewing between him and the Italian media, because he's been so amazing in GT3 racing in terms of what he's achieved. And like you mentioned as well, he was part of the Ferrari Driver Academy. He had a go in GP2, and arguably I feel if he was in like an ART or if he was in a Prema, maybe he would have had a team more around him that could like deliver a car. Because people look at F2, well, what we call it F2 today, and say, oh, well, all the drivers are in the same car, so all the opportunities are equal. But even then, you see in spec series that the teams that have more experience and the best mechanics and know how to have prehistoric data, they know how the tire models work, it makes a huge difference. So it was sad that he didn't get that break. And then, of course, as well, just him breaking away from that flock, but then him going back as well to his Mercedes roots, because he had done some Euro F3 racing, I think, with Mercedes. I think he won the Macau Grand Prix as well, like an exhibition race at Macau as well with Mercedes-Benz car behind him.
I'm never sure how much with the F3, because it was Euro F3 he was the champion of. He was racing with Prema at the time, if I remember correctly. But the thing with F3 is they had like a choice of, I don't know whether it was true at that point, but certainly later on when like Lando and co won it and he was racing in it, they're basically a choice of two engines between the VW unit and the Mercedes unit. So a lot of drivers wore Mercedes badges on their overalls when they were racing in that, because kind of lack of options. But obviously you go with the power unit that you think you can use the best, or sometimes afford, perhaps, if it's small differences, but they all count. I mean, they're still working with variants of those engines now, I think, in the Dallara 320 chassis they use in Japanese F3. I think it's now like Super Formula Lights or something, and in Euro Formula Open, where they run the more modern version of that F3 chassis, and they're now using HWA plants and something, and the HWA is basically the old Mercedes unit.
Yeah, which I think was I'm trying to remember, because I think it's the same. It's not Dallara. It's for the lack of, I think HWA had like a hand as well in like that. I think it was the Thomas Neubauer era of like the Mercedes like program. I think in the early 2000s, where you had like the Mercedes and McLaren partnership. And I'm just trying to remember the name of the. It begins with D, but it's not Dallara. I think it's another like tuning company with Mercedes and AMG and that kind of spiel as well. But it is interesting just to see how it applies, and just even with the drivers, their relationships kind of pivot almost on that basis and their careers too. Because when we spoke to Raffaele on, I'm gonna plug the podcast here as well, Stripping Dipping podcast. Sure, check it out if you guys love awesome content. But
Well, I
yeah,
was going to give you the chance to do that at the end, but if you want to do it now,
thank you. But yeah, just you know, when we spoke to him, he just said that relationship with Ferrari started to kind of decay him, and I think Olive Bene, which was the team principal Ferrari at the time as well, didn't really see eye to eye, which again was it shocked me because Olive Bene is quite an outspoken, more typical Italian, very like shouty.
maybe that was part of the problem.
True.
I don't know. But if you don't have the support of the people above you, then it's going to become difficult. So I think it's fair to say that Lello's found a good home for himself in Mercedes AMG.
Well, absolutely, and actually, I think this would be a good segue for something I just wanted to ask you as well, David, in terms of where do you see the future of Le Mans? Because now we obviously have the hypercar division and like this whole LMDH thing. And I think Bruce Jones, another kind of person I spoke to recently, like a GT commentator, is mentioning that it's a good thing for drivers like Raffaele Marcello to be part of some sort of factory program where if Mercedes, for example, were to take the Project One and to launch it into the Le Mans program, they have a factory driver right there that can do all of the stuff for them.
Mm. Well, it's that thing is it's never a bad thing having like a works factory deal where you like with their go-to driver. I don't know where it'll go to actually because it's such a thing of flux at the moment, isn't it? Where they're talking about some GT3 special thing or whatever, which is like normal GT3 but with a little bit more aero or something, which is going to cost more. Apparently, is going to be about the only difference. And it's just like, well, why not just if you're going to do GT3, why not just do GT3?
Freeze, yeah.
But because they're getting rid of the GTE Pro category practically, aren't they?
And that was sad as well because it was literally just Ferrari. Well, say sadly, I've got Ferrari man in front of me, but it was Ferrari, Porsche
for a while, to be honest with you. You know, I remember a few years ago when you had like Porsche and Ferrari and Aston, and you know Corvette turning up for Le Mans, and you had Ford when they had their new GT40 in it. So probably about 2016 time then, and you had like 10, 12 drivers, teams, cars, complete pro lineups in them, and that was really good. And then when you drop down to about 4 cars, it feels a bit sort of like, well, if that car breaks down, then so you know, winning a championship or winning a race or whatever else is still important. It's still special, especially if it's something like Le Mans, where just surviving it sometimes is like a big thing. But I can't help thinking in a category like LMP2, for example, where you've got like 20 odd cars all competing for it, it means a bit more than, say, Toyota winning against another Toyota and basically no one else, which we've had in the top category for the last few years. So it's kind of all relevant. But the top category next year and in the coming few years could very much have a revival, which it needs.
I agree. And on the topic of that as well, David, like, is there anything from the Ferrari camp on, like, maybe a prototype car coming out from them at all?
I don't know. I keep seeing sort of, you know, artist imagers and all this sort of thing, but I've not seen anything sort of concrete or announcements about it too much. I have to keep looking on the website, I guess.
Sure.
But obviously, you know, they've got a plan in place. They're just not busy going into massive amounts of details about it. The last thing I think I saw was more to do with the GT3 296 GTO that was testing, but not, you know, nothing, you know, beyond, you know, it feels nice. There's sort of like no real details too much about it, but
sure,
I'm sure they'll have fun when they get their hands on it properly to develop it.
Most definitely. But on the topic of that as well, you mentioned the 296. By the way, beautiful car. Like, at first when I heard that the 488 was going to go, I was like, oh, like, that car, it was like a nice evolution of the 458. I just think it just looked pretty in any livery, any guys, it always just looked amazing. But now that I've seen the 296, I was like, ooh, she's very pretty as well. So any kind of words on that, or like how do you think it will stack up in this kind of crop of GT3 racing at the moment?
Well, see, I mean, obviously it's been designed to try and do the job, but to a slightly different recipe and stuff. So like the V6 turbo down from the V8, but obviously they'd already changed from the net aspirated V8 that we had in the 458. So I don't think it's like the massive jump necessarily that, you know, going from the 458 to the 488 was already the one that sort of like purists were complaining about, because obviously you got the difference in the sound of the engine and stuff, and the naturally aspirated V8 and the 458 you know, especially like the special versions of it that you got towards the end, you know, that's the one that people still, you know, sort of cry about. So I don't actually think this is as big a sea change as perhaps we've already seen, but um I've completely forgot where my train of thought was going with that one. But yes, I don't, in terms of, you know, numbers and everything else, I mean, it should, obviously when you're racing with GT racing as well or whatever else, you've got, you know, BOP, which almost makes it irrelevant how much power or whatever your original base car had, because by the time it hits a track, obviously it's then going to be very different. And it's then going to have whatever restrictions like the governing body then puts on it to make it more competitive or on an even level with the cars it's racing against. BOP has its fans, it has its detractors. You can guarantee if your car is off the pace, the first thing you're going to complain about is the BOP.
Sure.
But it kind of has to be there to stop it turning into a complete financial arms race, because, you know, for people to go racing, for cars to be affordable, there has to be a rule in place sort of limiting what people are going to chuck at it. My take on it.
I think that's a fair take, though, David. And it is interesting because we are seeing a kind of mix as well of more gentleman drivers on the grid with the Pro Am classes and just like the Am classes generally. On top of that, as well, you've got likes of like Valentino Rossi, for example, where, you know, very successful individual, must I say, you know, but again, this wanting to try his hand in something a bit different, jumps into GT3, has kind of like a work still with WRT and one of their lead drivers. But then, you know, I'm assuming it's coming out, some of it's coming out of his pocket to run that Audi R8 Evo car this year and whatnot too. So at least it makes it an attractive proposition for the people that have the money. And like you mentioned too, like, by at least policing it in that way, one, you can be sure that the racing's going to be a lot more closer. And again, even last week at Zandvoort, it was very close. I was like on the edge of my seat for that safety car restart when we had Timo Bogoslawski in AMG, the Acodis AMG, just holding on for dear life with those Audi guys behind us. But it's amazing just how it can throw that up. And if people are looking, that's the next thing I really wanted to bring to this episode too. If people are looking for an alternative to Formula One, there's so many different motorsport disciplines out there, you know. And if you're more brand orientated like me or you, and you're into Ferrari or Mercedes or Lamborghini or Audi, they participate in a lot of these different series too. There's a lot of familiar names there too. I mean, another funny kind of Easter egg I'll mention to you, David. I saw Adrian Sito taking part in the Ferrari Challenge the other day, and I was like, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
I remember. I hear you saying, because I remember watching the or listening to the interview that you were saying to someone else about that, and I can't remember which interview it was.
Because Bruce Jones, because he as
Yeah.
well was like, wow, okay.
But no, it's strange the people who turn up in that. Because I remember a few years ago, there was 2013 GP2 Championship as sort of a bit of a much maligned one, as in, like, you know, the driver lineups in it were perhaps not as strong as they were in like Renault World Series or what have you at the time, which 2012, 2013, Dennis is probably a fair argument, because 2012, 2013 Renault World Series really was, you know, that was the proper ones. The guy who won the championship in 2013, I remember him rocking up in Ferrari Challenge, like the World Championship event thing they had. I think it may have even been a Daytona that year.
Mhm.
And he won that event and
Ah.
then got like handed the trophy by Sam Bird and James Collado, who were handing out the trophies there. The irony being, he'd beaten them to the
In
GP2 title.
so is the case.
Just thinking, considering the way their careers diverged from there, I think he must be a bit gutted. Because that was the only time I've ever seen him since, and he's just disappeared completely off the radar since then. I think it's Fabio Lima, something like that. But I've never seen him race anything since. So motorsport is one of these things of sometimes it is just being lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time or speak to the right person, I think. Because it can make a brilliant career, or you can disappear in a very expensive ball of smoke very quickly as well, I think. So
It is one of those things, and I was just thinking as well, because like I was like making some notes and thinking about things to ask you as well. Ferrari as well have had that thing where there have been times where they've just been dominant and the drivers really flourish, and there've been times where you see drivers, you're like, you deserve more. And when I think of drivers like that, it's like the likes of John Alesi, which I think managed one race win with Ferrari.
yeah, he should have had more. The thing is, John Alesi is the kind of driver that Ferrari fans love because he's sort of very symbolic of Ferrari in itself, as in so much flair, so much potential, so much ability to completely ruin the race for himself. And we love that, we like excitement. But occasionally it's just like head in hands moments. But I mean, if you look at the sort of drivers that we look at, I mean, we love our serial winners. We love Niki Lauda, we love Michael Schumacher. A lot of people's favorite driver, though, Gilles Villeneuve.
You know, I was gonna
My
say.
favorite driver is Gilles Villeneuve. Um, so yeah, again, a guy never afraid to take it to the limit and uh, beyond it on many an occasion. So but it gets your heart going, the blood pumping, the excitement. I mean, people have compared Charles Leclerc to Gilles. Um, if you're thinking a 21st century, slightly toned down, more media savvy one,
Mhm.
because you have to be a bit more switched on to that sort of thing now than you were back in the late 70s. But the same sort of boyish enthusiasm, the same trying to drive the wheels off it, because Charles does. It's the one thing we can say about him is the rough edges he certainly has, but he's got pace to burn. So I can see the comparisons there. I mean, saw someone on Twitter saying sort of like, Enzo Ferrari would have kicked Charles Leclerc out of his office. And I'm thinking, no, he wouldn't. That's
No,
exactly the kind of driver Enzo
yeah.
likes.
I was gonna say the same. Just like when I was thinking of a typical Ferrari driver, I think that Charles is like the ultimate ambassador of what Ferrari is, that passion and just that like raw edge. And I was gonna ask you, just like, and you kind of partly answered the question there already, but just how do you view Charles in comparison to the likes of like Jules Villeneuve and like John Alesi as well? Because he's just got that flair and that energy, and just I remember that race where he terrorized Lewis in Monza, where he just completely just ran him off the road, and it's like obviously Mercedes
this
fan.
is my part of the track. I'm going to, I'm first. I'm staying in first. Um, but I mean, if you look at the few races leading up to that, it was like Austria, obviously, where he was having the battle with Max, and it's like Max just sort of pushed him a little
Edged
bit
him
over
out.
that edge, and Charles said after that, "Okay, this is how we're racing now." That was how he went
Yeah,
racing.
and the retaliation was immediate because I remember the following round in Silverstone, him and Max had it out for corner and just
That was
like
good to
tooth
watch.
and nail. But it was great to watch. I agree, and I like that about him because he's not as polarizing as Max, I would say. But having said that, he still just got that energy and just that dog about him. And it's even going back to the whole Lewis Hamilton kind of thing as well with the Italian Grand Prix. He knew how much it meant to the Tifosi to get a win, in Monza. Like, he knew what the job was, he knew what the assignment was, and he didn't let them down. And I always have seen him, like, as soon as him and like Seb were in the same team, I always kind of felt sorry for Seb in a sense of I knew he was gonna be ushered out. And I'd actually want to get your comments on that too, David, because it seemed like there was a bit of a Ferrari kind of thing internally in relation to promoting Charles in. Because I think Marchioni, God bless his soul, like he was like, yeah, put him in, and he kind of gave me that Enzo Ferrari vibe, like just like with Nicky, when Nicky came in and he said to Enzo, your car is crap. And then Enzo was like, what? And then Nicky was like, no, you need to change this, change this, change this, change this. And they did it and it actually worked, whereas I think obviously who's the other one? The big geezer, the tour guy, that was team principal at the time. No, how have I forgot his name?
The current team principal.
No, not Matteo, not Bonotto, the guy before him. I mentioned Arriva Bene. There we go. Yeah. I think Arriva Bene was more kind of like Team Seb and almost like the stability of just having him and Kimi, and almost like Seb being the guy to do it and then Kimi just being like, there in the background. What was your take on just the whole thing at that time as well, with bringing Charles in and kind of the drama or kind of the energy it created?
Well, I think the problem is when you've got a young, hot driver or whatever else, I mean, he could have stayed at Sauber for another year, but there was always sort of the feeling that the Seb-Kimi partnership had possibly gone as far as it could have gone. I mean, I saw other people saying, like, if Kimi had stayed at Ferrari that year, it would have taken out some of the internal tension or whatever else of the young guy trying to prove him. And the result at the end of the year would have looked stronger because the dynamic would have been better. But we've had that conversation going into this year about Mercedes with, Valtteri versus George. So, I mean, I personally think it was the right choice because it's like either the guy's good enough or he isn't. Now, as I said, the thing with Charles is he could have stayed at Sauber for another year, potentially, but would that necessarily have got him any more? He went to Ferrari, and a lot of people I've seen stuff saying, like certainly in the early part of the year, Seb had his number out, qualified him, this, that, and the other. But you also had the thing where before the season had even started, Matteo was talking about team orders and how they'd benefit Seb if it came to it and all this. And in the first race, there was a team order for Charles to stay behind Seb and not fight against him. So it's sort of like you can't compare numbers really when you're at that point and the conversation's already doing that. There were so many races where it's like, I mean, people were talking about how bad Ferrari strategy and stuff was, but the drivers were literally tripping over each other. How do you employ strategy at that point to stop them doing that? And because they were racing each other, but you can't at the same time not have them racing each other because that's the pace they had, that's where they were at. Charles was arguably quicker. Seb understood the cars better, understood the tyres better, understood what he could do with them better. You want Charles for qualifying and perhaps for the race, I don't know. But it's comes with experience, and obviously as it's progressed, Charles had to deal with bad cars. He's had to deal with over driving some bad cars, which has perhaps seen him get more of a reputation for crashing than he perhaps deserves. And this year, I mean, people talk about him like losing like the points advantage and whatever he's had, and there's been like base part of 100 points swing between him and Max in the past few races. But it's like, Imola aside, how much of that's actually his fault? Like name another incident that you could put it. So yeah, I wouldn't say Charles was the full package just yet, but definitely the coming guy.
No, I was going to agree with you on that one, David. And I think Ferrari couldn't afford to let this one go down. I know, obviously, Arriva Bene would have liked to just have like the docile kind of thing with Kimi and Seb and to have that neutral environment. But you do need to spice up and change it up once in a while. We've seen, like you've alluded to correctly as well, just Mercedes just take that plunge because they had George just sitting there, wasting his talent after. So, I mean, there's a point where you're a new driver and obviously you just want them to gain the ropes and understand Formula One generally and what it's like to work with a team. But if George was at like Williams even this year, I think a lot of people be questioning what is he doing there. And then obviously with Ferrari as well, another thing people probably wouldn't think about is they had the likes of Jules Bianchi too. There as like a driver in the Young Driver Academy that would have probably got there as well had it not been for the unfortunate thing that happened. So
it is almost sort of like it feels like the completion of the story to a certain extent. Like Charles come into Ferrari and is now sort of fulfilling the role and the potential and the promise that his godfather never got the chance to do.
Exactly,
It's
yeah.
that sort of fairy tale almost.
It is a magical story. I agree with you, and it's good that he's not. I don't think he's let you guys down because you rightfully mentioned there too that all right, there was a thing in Imola, but again, he was pushing. He didn't want, he wanted to try and kind of do like a damage limitation thing, I guess. And even if Max was going to win that race, try and at least get second, which I think he had the pace to get Perez. It's just the timing of it, and then obviously just the impact with the chicane and stuff like that. That happens. You'd rather go out, trying to do something than do nothing at all, and I think he is a real racing driver and he embodies what a real Ferrari driver is about because it's that edge of pushing. And even when you listen to like the likes of Luca de Montezemolo, and talking even to him about what makes a Ferrari driver and what makes the DNA of the team and the brand and the passion and the success and the history, it's all of these things combined. I think he's like a modern day kind of equivalent of all of those things. So it's been amazing to see. And kind of on the topic of that as well, David, on Formula One talk, like, I know you're wincing already, just like, how do you see?
It's just funny because, I invite you on my channel, we'll have a chat and stuff and all this. And it does feel very much like
but I think this is the first time we've met.
Here, answer any questions,
But it's interesting, because David, obviously in my camp, I've got like, the Mercedes fans and obviously Team LH, and I love them. They're an amazing community, but it is refreshing as well just to meet somebody outside the box. And I do sim racing, with a Red Bull fan, and he's like 20 years old, so he's really just kind of that Max Verstappen generation, very just kind of like, it is what it is, black and white, and just is what it is, and then I've got you as well, which you're much more experienced.
Yeah.
Nah, don't look a day over 27, man.
How old do you think I am?
I've had to say a good 39, 42.
I'm 43.
Okay, nearly got there.
Next month.
Okay, hey, the lucky number. Age 24. But yeah, hey, you honestly, I wouldn't have even think you've aged nicely, So yeah, just if I saw you at like one of the what do you call it, like the historical events at what was it, like Goodwood? I say,
it's Goodwood this weekend, isn't it?
Exactly. Which another question I'll ask you now. Now this is like roles reversed. Top 5 cars you'd like to see at Goodwood, or you've seen at Goodwood? Because I imagine you've probably been before.
I've been once. I mean, some of it is distance, some of it's cost and what have you. It's you have the resources available to you that you have. So getting there and going is occasionally not that easy. But I went there for a day. Anyone going to Goodwood or anyone who wants to go to Goodwood who's not been there before, make it at least 2 days, because you've got the stuff going up and down the hill, seeing the cars doing that. You've got the whole paddock area where all the cars are parked and everything, and it's just so much stuff. You go there and there's like 25 Formula One cars there from various vintages or whatever else. You'll have another 2 rows and there's like garage bit where all the cars are held, where it's just like, sports cars from like the 80s and 90s. And we went there, and I think there was the Porsche thing on the year we went. So they had like about 7 like Porsche 917s alone, never mind the other ones. It was just like mad. Asking me what cars would I like to see going up and down there, it's just like you see so much stuff. It's like where do you start, finish, and end almost. But the 250 GTO there, which is like belongs to the drummer from Pink Floyd, whose name for some reason is escaping me at the moment.
Nick, it's Nick something.
Yeah,
Oh man, we're having a howler today, David, with names
we
of
are, aren't we?
people.
In my defense, I've been like outside a lot the last couple of days, sanding down bloody window ledges and painting them and stuff. So I think I'm suffering from heat stroke or something. But
Oh no.
it's so I'm gonna blame that. I'm
You've
drinking a
got your
lot of
excuse
water at
lined
the
up.
minute, trying to rehydrate myself.
Nick Mason, I found it.
Yes, that's the one. There's in Maranello, they've got a restaurant there, right next to the Fiorano track. So you get a lot of the drivers, a lot of the engineers and stuff go in there. And basically it's like wall to wall, like Ferrari memorabilia, pictures of like the owner with drivers and things that people have left there. And there's a signed pair of drumsticks from Nick Mason they've got in there on one of the wall
Hey.
bits, in between the hundreds of other things there, But it's almost like having a meal in a museum walking into that place. But it's great.
I could imagine. And on the topic of Nick Mason as well, was he not the guy that had the McLaren F1 and then it got crashed? I don't know if he was driving it at the time, but he had like a really rare McLaren F1, like the supercar. And
I don't know. I mean, I know Rowan Atkinson had a habit of binning McLaren F1s.
probably one of the most expensive habits there is, to be fair.
Yeah. The insurance company apparently decided that they had to rebuild the car because that would be cheaper than trying to get hold of another one, because obviously value.
Goes up, yeah.
Mm. But McLaren F1, like long tail Le Mans one, I suppose that'd be quite good to see going up the Goodwood Hill. So they got that in like obviously the MTC had that displayed and all them kind of things. But that's another place which is like a museum. Just
I can imagine.
I mean, I never got round to recording it, but because of the way it's designed, I remember reading a Mark Priestley's book, The Mechanic, which is
Yeah,
a brilliant
McLaren,
read.
right?
Yeah, that's a great read. And he was saying that basically when they designed it, it was designed by an architect, and the architect clearly knew nothing about designing like a factory. Because basically, from the point of view of like a building, an impressive building for people to see stuff in and what have you, fantastic. From the point of view of building a working factory, apparently it's like the race bays are the completely opposite end of the factory from like the loading docks and all this sort of stuff.
Oh no.
But the one thing they've got there is like where the canteen is, right at the far end of like the boulevard where all the cars are. They've got like the canteen just sort of on the corner, and to get to the entrance to the canteen, you've got to walk past where all where their trophy cabinet is, and they've got like all their trophies, all of them, first, second, thirds, even their wooden spoon or something, or the one they got for winning like the raft race or something at Canada one year. Even, you know, so, but that's the thing with that factory is, I mean, I've not been in like loads of factories, but I went in the MTC, and it is just designed to like you walk in, as soon as you walk in there, the history and the meaning and everything, and you're doing this for a reason. Like, this is the history that you are then part of. So I can imagine that being a very good place to work. we went there because my wife won like a walk around thing in a competition, and we went there shortly just after like the McLaren Honda disaster. Probably
Ah,
about the second year that Zach Brown was in there. But even the way that the people were talking, because you go round and there's a guide and whatever, but even the way the guides were talking and everyone, there was such, or even then, in the like, where they just had a couple of dark years, there was still a lot of positivity and stuff about it, and a real feel like, they were on the verge of a change, that things were going to go get better. So it's that. It's like we always say about Formula One or whatever else. If you can deal with like the hours and stuff, it must be an amazing thing to work in. But it's just the hours and the work and the whatever else must be insane. Um, I don't think I could do it. I'd love it for about a week, and then it's like
I'd be exactly the
it's
same
like I
boat.
need a bed. I need to see my family. I need to. I could imagine that being very difficult for people.
Absolutely, and that's the thing with the teams as well, especially if you're at like McLaren or Ferrari or Mercedes, the pressure must just be immense from week in, week out. Especially, if it's a team which has lots of heritage and they should be, higher up, and yet they haven't got the philosophy or the regulations correct, or there's been a bad pit stop and now all the pit stop boys are getting a bit of a flack. It must be one of those things.
Yeah, that was the thing about it. I saw something on Twitter saying that out of all the teams, despite the tyres being heavier, McLaren was the only team whose pit stops had got quicker. And because I'd just seen this straight after, obviously, the disaster they had at the last race, I'm thinking, how bad were they last year? Um,
Oh,
I know it's just because of timing of when you
Hmm.
see stuff, but
It always
that was
happens to be though. Just like when something like that positive comes out, it will be on the eve of something tragic happening. And I love Lando's like sense of humor too, because he's just sitting there, and then somebody asked him like, "Yeah, what happened with your pit stop?" He's like, "Yeah, I was sitting there, and my car loves tires. It needs tires to go." So with his like dry sense of humor, and I was like, "Oh dear, they've
I
had a
think
mare."
with Lando, you either get him or you don't.
Mm.
And if you don't get him, you'll find him hard work. But yeah, he's an interesting character.
Yes, most F1
Um,
drivers are, to be fair, especially this generation as well.
well, I say is to be any sort of level of success in life or whatever. I suppose you've got to be, a certain way, have a certain drive, have a certain focus, and whatever. I mean, we talk about like Formula One drivers and like how they come across, and ruthless is the wrong word. Well, in some cases, obviously, there's some drivers who perfected it to an art form
Michael.
because, yeah, Michael. But that's my point about Michael Schumacher is that everyone's very quick to sort of say, the incident here, the incident there, or whatever. But he was coming into racing. We talked about him when he was part of the Mercedes program, for example, 1990, 1991. If he was, knowing that Mercedes were looking at a Formula One program at that time, and he might get to be part of it. Now, if you're in a junior Formula and you're looking at Formula One, thinking I'm going to be racing in there at some point, you're always looking at the people who are racing in it and what they're doing and what level they're racing at, and you're thinking, okay, well, if I come against them, how am I supposed to beat them? And the people he was looking at was people like Prost and Senna. 1989, 1990, Suzuka. I'm kind of thinking if Michael's looking at that going, so I've got to beat Ayrton Senna, and he's watching some of them antics, I can forgive Michael perhaps a little bit for getting carried away. That's just my take on it. It's like
I would
obviously
second you on
you
that
you
as
you
well.
you learn from the people who you want to be at that level from. Um, and he just happened to be looking at a very competitive, very feisty, very kind of angry.
Well, David, what I was gonna say as well is that like that is almost the magic of Michael, and like even why like my dad for my dad, Michael could do no wrong. Like it doesn't even matter if he parked a car at Monaco and caused a yellow flag and ruined everybody's qualifying lap. in my dad's eyes, it was just genius. And that was Michael, you know, he pushed the limits of what you could just about get away with. And he wasn't always in the fastest car. People will remember Michael, obviously, for his dominant years at Ferrari and obviously the F 2004, which, oof, amazing car. And story even behind that, like, I'll probably discuss that after. But just Michael on the whole, he never always had it. And even when he joined Ferrari, people watch the documentary, people soon find out that Ferrari was not that competitive at the time either, and he didn't win the championship in his first year with Ferrari either. It took years to get to that stage. So you have to do that. And even with Max, as much as I'm kind of on the opposite side of that, being a Lewis or being a Mercedes fan, I get it from kind of Red Bull's point of view. They had like a drought from having Sebastian Vettel and winning so many championships on the bounce, then having a drought for nearly like 7 years. And then you get this young charger in Max, which has no fear. And then he also has his dad, just Verstappen, which equally was very handy back in the day too. And there's lots of stories, which I won't get into on this segment about Just. But yeah, just, you know, sometimes you have to just, you know, just go the extra mile and push the boundaries of what you can do. And like bringing it back to Michael, I loved it personally as a kid. I thought it was great. And, you know, he was giving Damon Hill a hard time. He was giving Jack Villeneuve a hard time. He's giving Pablo Montoya a hard time. And even when he's at Mercedes, he's giving Rubens Barrichello, his ex-teammate, a hard time at Hungary. You know, so
in fairness, Montoya gave him a hard time back. So
yeah,
that was just the way they were racing.
Exactly.
But it's a slight headache, but it's all good. No, I mean, I've got Michael pictures myself, obviously. Pictures of seeing his cars and all the rest of it, Maranello. But yeah, no, I mean, showing my age, I started watching Formula One probably in the mid 80s and stuff. And the dominant teams at the time, but you know, McLaren, Williams, and I remember seeing them race. And for some reason, perhaps because they were winning all the time, and every time I watched it, they were always winning. Not knowing as a kid the history behind the teams and whatever else, I just found them a bit cold, clinical, and professional. You know, and it was always like these same sort of couple of drivers winning and stuff. And so it was like whenever any other team beat them, it was like, oh, awesome. And then, you know, you had this young driver come along and suddenly was like not backing down from Ayrton Senna and was trying, you know, come 1992, actually won a race and was, you know, fighting against all these established names and stuff, you know, Michael Schumacher. So I completely get like the way people react when a Lewis Hamilton or a Max Verstappen comes into the sport and is suddenly like out of nowhere, suddenly upsetting the apple cart and, you know, taking it to the established people. But Michael was my guy who did that, you know, so I I appreciate how others feel as the generations have gone on.
I just think, like, even for me, David, like, he's just up there, just obviously you have this whole debate of greatest driver of all time, and that is just like a redundant conversation I see on Twitter week in, week out. But in terms of just what he did for the sport, just the way he galvanized Ferrari together and built them into a winning outfit again with the likes of John Todd and obviously Russ Brawn and this Rory Byrne and those guys as well. It just makes for such a legendary story. And then it wasn't just Michael; he also had his brother Ralph as well, which was at Williams, and then did a stint at Toyota as well, which probably wasn't as relevant. But just it's amazing. And then even on the flip side, when you just look at Mika Hakkinen, and another funny thing you mentioned this drivers and how like unique they are compared to just normal beings or mortals like me and you, and just you can take two complete like drivers from the same background because you've got Mika Hakkinen, a Finnish successful driver, you've got Kimi Räikkönen, a successful Finnish driver. But then again, even them two are very different because like Mika, you could see sometimes how emotion would get to him. And I can't remember the year, but there was one race he threw it away at Monza and he's on the side of the track, hands in the head, and just crying his eyes out.
I think it was 1999 because that season was just the year nobody wanted to win the title.
Everyone's just throwing away.
You know, you had McLaren dropping the ball and losing results here and there. You know, when I mean, the European Grand Prix that year, I swear they had about 4 different people lead that race at one point. And then was it Johnny Herbert won it and it's Stewart? It was something
Wow.
stupid like that,
Mhm.
you know. But yeah, Michael obviously broke his leg at British Grand Prix that year, which then, because I'm pretty sure he could have had the title that year if it hadn't been for that incident. You know, if Eddie Irvine nearly won it. I'm pretty
Chances
sure
are.
Michael could have. That's all. You know, we'll leave it that. But you know, there were results going begging. Like I think it was the Italian Grand Prix or the European Grand Prix, where it might have been the European Grand Prix where Eddie Irvine came in for a pit stop and left with like 3 wheels, when he could have won that race. And you know, Frentzen had an incident in that race as well when that could have put him into the lead of the championship in a Jordan, and it was that kind of
Yeah.
season. um, so yeah, I keep wanting to find a like 1999 season review just to remind myself of how mental it was because that is one of them years.
Yeah.
You know, um, I don't know, I've completely lost track of the original conversation and.
You know, just speaking about like
So, I mean,
drivers and how
we were
different they are.
doing
Yeah.
well when we managed to like go off on a tangent like 5 minutes into the video, and we're now like 1 hour, 5 minutes into the video. I'm really not sure what title I'm going to put on this because you know normally you'd like put like the header title, what the original question was, and then maybe add a few other comments or
Sure.
something. This was like a few other comments and maybe the original point somewhere.
Motorsport nostalgia at its finest. But
Yeah,
yeah, just
Denzel interviews me.
hey, they're getting a preview for the next podcast we're gonna do in a couple of weeks. So definitely.
Yeah, no. Because it has been over an hour. And we have completely lost track of what we were doing and what they were originally talking about anyway. It has been a fantastic. I mean, I remember you managing to have a 2 and a bit hour podcast after Monaco. So probably not going to do that this time.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who that was because that's the thing as well, David. Like, it's amazing just how we can connect with each other and just there's so much going on currently, but then also you can contrast and compare it with what's gone in the past, and some of it sets a complete new precedent, and some of it's just literally a blueprint of what already exists in a modern guise. So it is just fascinating to have these conversations, and by all means, I'd love to be back on here again and to just chop it up with you because it's been amazing, and yeah, there's so many different memories.
Yeah. But I will let you. I mean, you've already sort of talked about stripping the dipping earlier, but you know, if you want to discuss more of your various channels and other bits and pieces, because you've got your own brain's done that thing again.
Sim racing.
You're a sim racing channel as well, yeah.
Yeah,
So you
thank you
want
for
to talk
that.
about them?
Thank you, David. Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor on that. And yeah, just generally, I run a podcast as well with Georgina Donna, great woman. You know, she's really into motorsports and just generally having great conversations, which is why we have you coming on in a couple of weeks' time as well. So it's going to be amazing to have you on our platform too. But yeah, just generally speaking, stripping the dipping podcast. If you want to get the know in just on anything and everything Formula One, as she would say, we had Mario Andretti on there the other day, which again. David, just if you could make a movie about a driver, that has to be the guy. That has to be the guy. Like,
Well, I even commented on that one on your YouTube that basically if you didn't know anything and you just read a Hollywood script about his life, you'd think, oh, that's a bit far fetched. I'm not sure about that. But
it
that's,
happened.
yeah. I remember watching, you know, like Mansell going to IndyCar in 1993 and Mario being his teammate.
Yeah. Which is just, it's like, almost like you wouldn't believe that that kind of thing could exist. It's like two different parallels coming together. But that was it, you know. We spoke to the great legend, and again, for a guy in his 80s, he's so in his faculty, so in touch with what's going on, and he's so just open and honest about everything too. So, likes of him, we had Raffaello Marcello as well. So again, if you're a GT3 fan, if you're into that, make sure you tune in as well in relation to that episode that we did. And I think he's going to be coming back on later in the season too. So that's going to be great. And yeah, even for myself personally, like we discussed or we started on, just I love motor racing. Just always been a fan of cars and racing and just generally just motorsport and the whole. So a couple of years ago, I took out the investment to start sim racing, which David, if you want to have your marriage intact, I wouldn't recommend it because it's just, you start off with like your steering wheels and then pedals and then this simulator and that simulator and just, but honestly, it's such a nirvana because we talked about the 99 season and like in one of the sims, I have Michael Schumacher's 99 car. That car is so difficult to drive in terms of what you get in a simulation equivalent of it and how you have to drive the car and it's crazy. So yeah, I find myself doing a bit of sim racing and even competitively with the GT3 cars, which is cool too. And I try and like represent Raffaello Marcello. Probably not well since I haven't won any races this season, but yeah, just I do a bit of that too. And just generally, yeah, just you can find me on Twitter as well, AMG Denzel Clarkson. If you follow David, which I'm sure you are, if you're listening to this, then you can find me. And yeah, I like to like throw little jibs and jibes at David too. And if I see Ferrari have a mare, or I just see like a very weirdly colored Ferrari GTO.
Individually, I'm sure the color combinations on that Ferrari would have been fine, but together, no.
Yeah, I don't think Ferrari ends up.
It was the powder blue wheels that really done it. It's just like, what are you doing? Who on earth looked at that and thought, I'm going to spec that?
Exactly. And who at Ferrari signed that off? Because if Enzo was alive, there's no way that was ever going to get signed off as a custom order.
Well, it's that thing, is if they pay the money, it's their car, isn't it? So,
True.
That they can customize the thing however they want to, because they've got to drive the thing and own the thing at the end of the day.
Exactly.
It's like, so what you're saying is you wanted a Ferrari and you did that to it.
Fraud watch, basically. Anybody that does that to a Ferrari, they need to be assessed and put on some sort of register. What we'll call a register, I don't know, but you cannot do that to a Ferrari. That's just blasphemy. That's just wrong, man. So, yeah, just great just to have F1 Twitter and, to just throw jibes at David like that too when we see stuff like that, because it's crazy. And actually, one last thing as well, David. Like, I know I
serve a purpose.
I know, thank you. I was gonna say, like, what's your take been on Carlos Sainz too? Because I just wanted to get your thought on that as well. And kind of, can Ferrari still win this championship?
Can Ferrari still win this championship? Yes, but they need another upgrade that's gonna give them some sort of straight line parity with Red Bull, which they don't have at the moment. Because the thing is, you can build a car which can be quicker quite a bit of the lap, but the problem is, if on the straights, as soon as they get into DRS range, they're taking away any advantage you've got over the rest of the lap, and then have more straight line speed to go past you pretty much at will. Or you could be quicker than them the rest of the lap, but if you're behind them and then on the straights you can't get past them, then you're on hiding to nothing. All it took was one safety car in like Saudi Arabia, and handed the race pretty much to Max, because Charles just couldn't break free again after that as soon as Max got DRS. So Ferrari, I think, can win it, but they need luck and they need a good upgrade. But they could really done about the last 4 weekends or so. They need to stop having reliability issues. That's a lot of things that they need to have.
Yeah, and it's worrying, like you mentioned as well, when you see it not only in the factory team, but Alfa Romeo and also Haas, the customers. It makes you think, just like, it's been an amazing start for them, and I personally am rooting for them, whilst Mercedes like sorting their accident. But just generally, yeah, it's not nice. Just when you see, like, again in Baku as well, like I would have liked to know what Charles would have been able to do, because it would have been him against like the two Red Bulls. But again, we were robbed of that too because of the reliability issues. So it's tough.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been the best part of 100-point swing since like the fourth odd race of the season. You know, it's yeah, everyone's saying like, you know, Charles has such a lead. There's no way he can lose this, and suddenly he's 49 points behind, and it's through almost nothing he's done. And that's the real thing of that. But yeah, as I said, they need a lot to happen. They need a lot of things to go right. You know, there's still a lot of the season left. It's not impossible. I just, at this point, I'd be kind of happy if we got to the end of the season and we'd made some sort of fight out of it, rather than like having the 2017, 2018 thing of up to the halfway point, looking like, you know, we could be there, we could be challenging, and then it all going sliding away horribly. Yeah, if we're having our wobbles now, maybe that means it'll get better later.
Sure. You'd like to think that'd be the trend.
I'd like to hope so, yeah. Because at this rate, we're going to finish behind Mercedes.
Which, again, for us, like, we would take, but it's not obviously been a great season for us either, for where the car should be and what it's been doing to Paul Lewis and good old Judge.
Yeah, what's that thing of they went brave, and you know, obviously correlation between what happens on the track and what happens in your computer graphics and generated what have you, and the wind tunnel testing. You can't necessarily simulate everything. Bumps and I mean porpoising. I've seen and read things where they've basically said it's not really a surprise as such that the people who've got the best grasp on it are people like Adrian Newey and Rory Byrne to a certain extent, who, whilst not being there through like the whole of the original sort of underfloor,
like ground effects kind of era.
Yeah, but the knowledge of it, they remember issues that the teams had then, and you know how they had to sort them then. That when they were working with people coming up with this car, they could have gone, well, previously we had issues with this, so we need to be aware of it. You know, it was, whilst they might have not necessarily been there for developing the solutions, they still have in their heads, you know, that there was an issue. Whereas a lot of other teams, perhaps reliant on data, computer fluid dynamics, you know, wind tunnel model testing or whatever else, they might not have been so aware that it was going to be a potential issue. But that was just one theory I read. How true it is another matter. But it does seem strange that it's the two teams, first and second, that, well, I say that. I mean, Ferrari's porpoising is still pretty bad. It's just that theirs isn't as bad through the entire extremes that, say, Mercedes have been suffering with. So, yeah, theirs has been sort of manageable. But, I mean, the whole thing with porpoising is another conversation all on its own, because I mean, with everything that's going on with the FIA and with Formula One, and some teams wanting this and some teams wanting that, and how do you employ it with the cost cap, and how do you then, you know, do you employ something which is just going to affect certain teams, or do you try and put a blanket band-aid over which is going to affect all teams, and then how's that fair on the teams which have got stuff right?
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm not the person who has to try and sort it out.
Yeah. It must be a nightmare, I must admit myself. And yeah, like I had the same thing, because Max came in last week and he was like, oh, well, you know, even if Red Bull don't benefit, wink, wink, like it's unfair that they changed the rules mid-season where, you know, I get that, but then also you have Lewis saying this is a safety concern, and this is the pinnacle of motorsport. You shouldn't have like cars bouncing up and down like they're on like like what do they call them, low rider suspension in like El South, some part like Southern California in a rap video, bouncing up and down. So I see it from both sides, and it's I think it would be a boring season if we weren't speaking about something. So be it porpoising, and as repetitive as it is getting now, it's still interesting to see how the teams are going about trying to fix it, seeing how some teams just ride it out. Like you mentioned, Ferrari have it, but it's just that the car stabilizes a bit more in the corners anyway, so it's not as detrimental. And then you also get individual drivers. Like I think Leclerc said that it's there, but he's so like well built that he doesn't really feel it. Whereas for Paul Carlos, he's just been like, no, it's actually starting to affect my physical well-being, and it needs to change in some way, shape, or form. So it's hard for the teams to kind of rationalize the drivers' ride comfort and safety versus outright performance.
I suddenly realised you asked me a question about Carlos, so I completely forgot to answer.
That's okay.
I think he's had a few tough weekends. I mean, the thing is, everyone looks at last year and was like, "Oh, Carlos done so well. He outscored Charles. Carlos, potentially should be the #1 driver or whatever." And I'm just like, how many of them weekends was he actually ahead of Charles? The weekends he was, invariably it was because Charles had binned it in qualifying, and then they hadn't fixed the car properly, so it broke down before the start of the race, or because at Hungary where he got taken out. There's so many things you can point to explain the gap, because if you look at the numbers in terms of like how often Charles finished ahead of Carlos, how many times he outqualified Carlos, that doesn't support where they finished in the championship last year. And this year, I think we're sort of seeing some of it might be just because Charles, I think, has got more natural talent than Carlos. Carlos is more of an engineer, if it makes any sense.
Yeah.
He can work his way around problems or whatever, perhaps better, whereas Charles will just try and drive his way around problems. I did hear something about 1992, Mansell and Tracy, where it's sort of like almost a little bit the opposite, where Mansell was like had a bit of an engineering background or whatever, whereas Tracy relied a bit more on feel. And because you had the active suspension on the car, then basically Patrese didn't have the faith in it that Mansell had. So Mansell would just sort of put it into a corner and say, well, everything says it should do this. I'm going to drive it at this. And Patrese was going in, and not because dampers, and I'm not an engineer, I can't, but because it was a mechanical thing, not a normal suspension feel or whatever, it messed with how Patrese was driving. There's a reason he was 2 odd seconds a lap, sometimes slower than Mansell, because he just couldn't get comfortable in the car. It didn't mess with his normal way of driving, so they weren't normally, you wouldn't have, if you'd put them in a different car, they wouldn't have been like 2 seconds apart.
Sure.
But because of how comfortable and confident they were with that type of car, that type of suspension, suddenly it made what would have been a small gap exacerbated.
Yeah.
And I think with the current cars, when you've got certain drivers who need to feel a certain way to get the best out of a car, and suddenly they're finding themselves in a car that doesn't deliver that kind of thing, it's a noticeable difference. I always said that about Seb Vettel in the 2014 season, when Daniel Ricciardo went there. Mm-hmm. Because obviously you had the step change between different chassis and stuff. And you were a bit like George Russell going to Mercedes this year. George Russell stepping from last year's Williams to this year's Mercedes in terms of grip levels and whatever else is probably less of a sea change than it is for Lewis Hamilton going from like the all-conquering title winning car of last year to the completely delivers its grip and everything else in a completely different way car of this year. and I think that was very much how it was with Seb back in 2013, where you had like the style change, 2014, sorry, where you had like the complete chassis change and engine change and the stripped off the, you know, hot and cold blown diffuser gimmicks and all that sort of stuff. So you had Daniel Ricciardo coming from a car that had significantly lower grip than the one Seb had the previous year, stepping into that car, and it was less of a change for him than it was for Seb. And Seb's car did break down rather a lot, or at least that's how it seemed.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think there's comparisons there. But yeah, whenever you get new cars, especially the first year of new regs, there are some drivers who are always going to struggle more than others. And I think with Carlos, we've been seeing that a little bit at certain races this year. I think the last couple of races, he's been a lot stronger, a lot more consistent. I genuinely don't think that Charles could have beaten Max in Canada, just because of the way the Ferrari delivered its speed.
Sure.
It was getting no traction coming out of the last corner.
Because he was
it's
mentioning
never
as well.
had the top end that the Red Bulls have had. So.
Exactly. Because he was mentioning that as well. Like I remember hearing the team radios where he was saying something was wrong with the diff. It was meaning that the traction of the corners was pretty poor, and he just could not basically use the advantage of the car coming out of most corners. And then, like you mentioned too, like a Red Bull has just been strong all season with the straight line speed, which is funny for Red Bull because you'd think of Adrian Newey being the downforce guy, but somehow he's managed to go both.
The thing is, we're so used to them having a Renault engine, which is sort of asthmatic in the back of the car, that it can't, like, you know, they've got their pace around the corners, but put them on a straight and they're like sitting ducks or can't get anywhere near anyone. But so yeah, and then the first year of the Hondas and whatever else as well wasn't. So now it's just sort of they've got a slippery car which still delivers some pace, which is good for them, but not so good for everyone else. But you know, fair play to them. They've developed a great car, and hopefully they won't run away a bit.
I was going to say, I like the red one more, to be fair. So
I like the red one more. I don't know. Well, I'm doing my usual thing of being absolutely terrible at wrapping up a video. We had this when Nasha was on the channel. It's like I said, okay, well, we'll be going soon. You know, finish off the conversation and what have you. 20 minutes later, we were still talking. So, on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming up on the channel. I'm not necessarily sure it was the conversation I had in mind when I originally invited you to come on, but it's definitely the conversation we ended up with.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, David.
As people at home watching, I hope you've enjoyed our expansive view of the motor racing world. And thank you for watching very, very much, and bye-bye for now.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for having me. And then off to see the Red Hot Chili Peppers on Saturday. Oh, cool. So nice, cool band. And
I saw them at like Portman Road in Ipswich in like 2005. Okay. And in a football stadium, you're obviously like 150 odd meters away from them or what have you. You know, so when I say I saw them, it's all relative. Yeah. But I was in a place they were at.
That's good enough. I'll take that.
I like Ferrari because they're Ferrari, but it's sort of like it's a double-edged sword almost, you know, because they can be a great, amazing, capable, winning loads of stuff. My wife has said to me the high point of her season this year is seeing the anxiety on my face from the start of the race to the end of it while I'm trying to watch it. Because it's just like the possibility that at any moment it could go horribly wrong. Yeah. The thing I always say about being a Ferrari fan is it's never boring.
True. That is definitely
for better or for worse. It's never boring.
There's always something.